Or a big welcome. Let me get my grammar wrong in front of a bunch of school teachers. Welcome to the Institute for Advanced Studies Thursdays at 4 presentation, which is atypically in the Best Buy Theater. That's where you're sitting right now. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. And before we get on to the real reason everybody is here, I just want to make a couple of announcements. Cue the first one. So, as some of you probably know, the Institute for Advanced Studies sponsors residential fellowships for University of Minnesota faculty, and the deadline for the applications for that for 2016-2017 will be October 23rd. And we're holding information sessions on the St. Paul campus and here on the East Bank on October 7th and 8th. And you can find more information about the applications and also about the information sessions and a slideshow from the information sessions from previous years on our webpage. And next week, our Thursdays at 4 presentation will be downstairs, back in its usual space in the Crosby Seminar Room in the second floor, northeast corner of Northrop. And our speaker next week is historian Ari Kelman from Penn State University. You might have been reading about his recent graphic history, a book published with Jonathan Feder-Vorm called Battle Lines, a graphic history of the Civil War. But his talk next Thursday is based on the topic of his award-winning book, A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek. And so I hope you'll all come out again next week for Ari Kelman's talk. And last but not least, today's talk will be followed by a reception outside in the gallery. So if you go out either side and go towards that back wall, that's where the gallery is. And we hope you'll join us for that. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce the people who will introduce our speaker, Julian Vasquez Heilig, who is a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State University, Sacramento. His talk today is titled Education Reform, What Instead? Community-Based Education Policy as the Alternative to Top-Down Private Control. And this conversation today has been initiated by the IAS Collaborative, Private for the Public Good. And it's also co-sponsored by the Department of Organizational Leadership Policy and Development, the Department of Communication Studies, the College of Education and Human Development, and the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies. So I want to introduce to you the conveners of the IAS Collaborative, Private for the Public Good, Mary Vavris and Ruzbe Shirazi. And they will tell you more about their collaborative and introduce Dr. Vasquez Heilig. So I can't see into the lights. So Mary Vavris is Associate Professor of the Department of Communication Studies, where she teaches critical media studies. And her own research and teaching are informed by community engagement, particularly her relationships with many public school teachers. And she, like many of us, have watched how the struggle with the increasing quantity of high-stakes testing that current policy imposes on school teachers and schools is a constant source of tension. And this has dovetailed with her own research, examining the multiple roles that media play in legitimating policies that reproduce social inequalities, particularly around class, race, and gender. So Ruzbe Shirazi is awesome. He did not write that in his self-bio. I just want you to know. No. He's. We think Ruzbe is awesome, and in fact, he'll be an IAS residential fellow in the spring. So we're looking forward to having him. He's a faculty member in the program in Comparative and International Development Education in the College of Education and Human Development. But in a previous life, he was a public school teacher in a state-controlled district in New Jersey, and that was really a formative experience experience that opened his eyes to the perils and limitations of top-down control and high-stakes testing regimes. So his research looks at how schools in the U.S. and the Middle East serve as sites for making political meaning and framing social belonging. And he's been doing that work locally here in the Twin Cities, paying particular attention to the experiences with schooling of transnational and immigrant youth in a time in which we're witnessing heightened surveillance of immigrant communities. So without further ado, Mary Vavris.
Thank you, Jennifer. My role today is to give you a brief overview of our collaborative that has culminated in bringing Professor Vasquez Heilig here. But before I do that, I want to be sure to thank a few folks who've made this all possible. We'd like to start with the IAS. Thank you to the IAS for all the generous support of money and expertise that you've given us that made this collaborative possible. I'd like to thank Anna Farrell, our graduate assistant, who has done a whole lot of work over the summer to make everything happen over these next 2 days. And I'd like to thank my co-convener, Ruth Shirazi, who's been a real inspiration, has great ideas throughout the year this project has developed and evolved. So thanks to all of you. And I want to start with a story today because it really illustrates the way in which we've conceptualized private for the public good, ? Media treatments of education, citizenship, and opportunity. On Tuesday, I was working at home, and my 18-year-old cousin, who lives with us, came home from school, and he was all smiles and wanted to tell me something that he decided. He said, I made a decision. And because he's a senior in high school, I thought that decision might have to do with which colleges he had planned to apply to, or how he was going to study for the ACT, which is coming up. But in fact, neither of these was true, because what he wanted to tell me in very excited terms was he had decided that when he had children, he was sending them to private school because he knew they'd get a better education there. Which, of course, gave me a visceral reaction that I had to tame pretty quickly so that I could engage in the vigorous defense of public education that I did. After that vigorous defense of public education, he went upstairs to do his homework. I stayed downstairs to fix dinner, all the while thinking about what had just transpired between us. And I'm telling you this story because it illustrates the way in which we've thought about private for the public good, and the ways in which the idea that private schools, private systems are superior to public systems. Where does that notion come from? How is it that an 18-year-old boy who, to my knowledge, has never really thought about these things before, can assert with so much confidence that he knows that the private system is superior to the public school system? And Bruce and I believe that the mainstream media in this country have constitute a very important, maybe the most important site where these kinds of ideas proliferate and get transmitted and then are taken up by people like my cousin and plenty of other people as well. So over the course of our collaborative, what we have done is to look at all kinds of different media when they focus on the issue of K through 12 public education. We've looked at documentary films, Waiting for Superman, for example. We've looked at fictional film, Won't Back Down. We've looked at television programs. We've looked at news reports. We've looked at old public service announcements. And what we have kind of depressingly concluded is that the mainstream media do, in fact, have a dominant narrative about public education. And it seems to be in two parts. The first part is that there is a crisis in public education. There is an established sort of article of faith in these narratives that there's a crisis in public education, and at this moment that crisis can be traced to bad teachers, administrators who want to keep bad teachers in the classroom, and teachers' unions, by and large. The second part of the narrative is the remedy that the media that we looked at suggest for this crisis in public education. Remedies typically consist of very privatized sorts of remedies. So increasing the numbers of charter schools, increasing the numbers of and the stakes for the testing that's involved, and eliminating teachers' unions. And you know, the concerns that we have about that dominant narrative are many, but one of them is that there's very little resistance to it. We found very little pushback, at least in the mainstream media, to these particular narratives, which was giving us pause, to say the least. So when we encountered the work of Professor Vasquez Heilig, we were quite delighted, because his talk today, and I won't give you too much information about it, but his talk today is all about constructing an alternative media ecology, as he calls it, one that can challenge these kinds of conventional wisdoms and the common sense belief that private solutions and private education is the answer to public education's problems. So I'm looking very much forward to hearing from Professor Vasquez Heilig, and I'm going to cede the floor to my colleague Rusbe Shirazi, who will introduce our guest today.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today and braving the fine fall Minnesota weather that we're having here. I just want to take a second to thank Mary. It's been a pleasure working with you over the course of the past year. And I think just in that brief introduction, you can kind of see how she can take very big ideas and distill them down to something powerful, something concise, and something really interesting to be able to talk about. So it's been really fun working with you, Mary. Thank you very much. I also want to take the opportunity to thank a few guests who are here with us today, or who will be with us if they're not here right now. Representative David Bly, Representative Rena Moran, Betsy Orn from Minneapolis Public Schools, Tola Oyewole, who's the director of the Cargill Foundation, Michael Go, who's the Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Equity and Diversity here at the university, and Dean Jean Kwam from the College of Education and Human Development. So thank you for being here, for participating in this event, and being present, and contributing your energy and goodwill. I don't want to cover too much of the same ground that Mary did, but one thing I'd like to add to everything that we've said so far. One of the themes that emerged from in the discussions of our work as we're reviewing these movies, particularly how recent films like Won't Back Down, or recent-ish films like Waiting for Superman, what emerged for us was we saw that these are highly motivated representations of education. They're fighting for hearts and minds by drawing primarily on viewer emotions to depict the crisis in education at the expense of presenting well-developed arguments backed up with data. For those of you who haven't seen either of these films, the climax, and I would say both of these films, hinges around a lottery scene in which parents and students are anxiously waiting to see whether or not they get in. And these are a perfect example of kind of the work that media does in shaping the way that we think about public education. The films have this powerful emotional effect because they're depicting this overflowing demand on the part of low-income students, students of color and their families, for successful schools that work, that serve them. Because the neighborhood schools that they attend, public schools more often than not, have not been up to the task. What these scenes do not depict, and as I learned in my conversation with Dr. Vasquez Heilig today, is that access to these schools is often limited by eligibility criteria that keep certain children and their families out. So they're not necessarily open to all, even though they're being depicted as a solution for everyone. So in this sense, it's important to note how our emotions are being weaponized in this debate. The focus is kept on expanding access to these schools that work rather than investing energy and resources in public schools that serve the needs of all students. And the difficulty of critiquing some of the reform agendas that are proliferating right now is often tied to the lack of transparency around their data, while public schools are generally subjected to much higher levels of scrutiny. So when we started thinking about who we wanted to bring to speak to some of these issues and whose work addresses these issues head on, Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig came immediately to mind. He's worked in school districts, he's worked in Houston public schools, and he's seen up close how the movement towards greater accountability and high-stakes testing has negatively impacted public education. And through his blog, Cloaking Inequity, he has helped jumpstart and contribute to a national conversation about what kind of schools we need, and has brought some empirical clarity to critiques against the corporatizing models of education reform that are prevalent and occupying the stage in discussions of education reform. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig to the stage. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for bringing me here to the University of Minnesota. Also thank you for not bringing me in January or February. California is very lovely at this time of year. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a 3-for-1. Right? You go to 7-Eleven, they have the hot dogs, and they say 3 hot dogs for the price of 1. When we originally talked about this, I conceptualized this talk as being primarily about the different types of reform. But you know, I'm a policy analyst. I can be wonky, and I can get deep into and that might not be as interesting. So I want to do 3 things for you today. And I also want to invite you, for those that are tweeters, to tweet at me from the talk, if you're able to, at Professor JVH, which is Professor and then my 3 initials, JVH. So the 3-for is this. First, I want to discuss context. I recently gave a talk at Berkeley, and I jumped right into the community-based reform. I jumped right into the social media ecology, and I had some blank stares. So I want to start a little bit with the context of top-down private control reform, and then go to a conversation about the community-based approaches as alternatives to top-down reform. And then I'm going to get real personal and talk about how you as a person, you as an individual, can build your own social media ecology around education policy. So I will now begin with the current top-down private control school reform context. I believe we should call it aristocratic or perhaps plutocratic reform. I'd like to start with this portion of the conversation by introducing the 4 main components of what I'm calling aristocratic reform. First, aristocratic reform is controlled by the elites. It's top-down, it provides opportunity for profit and privatization, and they're often swathed in elegant but false narratives of civil rights. Are these approaches consistent with the vibrant democracy and democratic control of schools? Who are the aristocratic reformers? You're probably familiar with most of their names. Michelle Rhee, who is married to the mayor in my city, Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor Emanuel, the Democrats for Education Reform. But where are they getting their support? Where are they drawing this, what they call dark money, that fund aristocratic reform? Wall Street, wealthy elites, foundations such as the Gates Foundations and other corporate entities are underwriting aristocratic reform. The Democrats for Education Reform, for example, is a political action committee supported largely by hedge fund managers. They favor charter schools, high-stakes testing, school choice, including vouchers and tuition tax credits. In some cases, I consider it essentially money laundering public policy, mayoral control, alternative teacher preparation programs such as Teach for America. Diane Ravitch has taken to calling these billionaire funders the Billionaire Boys Club. There are many examples of aristocratic reform that can be discussed here today, but I will focus on just a few of the hot topics that are currently being discussed. Chicago, not far from here, is right now in the public consciousness because of the recent hunger strike that lasted more than a month at Diet High School. Parents, grandparents were protesting the purposeful lack of an open enrollment, community-based public school in their neighborhood. Who was responsible for this situation? Rahm Emanuel, famous bundler of Wall Street and other big money, brought his brand of aristocratic reform to Chicago. the mayorally appointed school board in Chicago, is that how you say it? Has been keen on cutting budgets, closing schools, especially those in minority communities, and then sending those same students to different low-performing campuses. Chicago is not the only epicenter of aristocratic school reformers. Their gospel is also being spread across the nation via the New Orleans takeover model. Despite national and state-level data demonstrating that the Recovery School District and the state of Louisiana perform last and nearly last in every single educational outcome, they're being promoted by proponents. Legislators are simultaneously filing bills to create New Orleans-style achievement districts across the nation. Is this purely coincidence? ALEC, a lobbying conglomeration of corporations, has spread model legislation across the nation seeking to take the chartering of schools out of the hands of local officials and place it in the hands of politically appointed charter boards. In Texas, for example, a group of wealthy businessmen, including John Arnold, a billionaire, a former Enron trader, bankrolled an attempted hostile takeover of the entire Dallas school district under an obscure Texas law from the 1990s called Home Rule. Fortunately, the community pushed back, and the takeover fell through, at least for now. Even in a progressive place like Washington State, aristocratic reformers have made headway. ALEC language was directly plagiarized and codified in a proposition for school choice. This reported by Wayne Out. This mattered until the Washington Supreme Court recently ruled that public money for privately controlled charter schools was not consistent with the state's constitution. Why would hedge fund managers and other aristocratic reformers like to see chartering taken out of the hands of democratically elected government officials and local communities and instead handed over to politically appointed boards, or see entire districts taken over, chartered, and run by politically appointed boards? Aristocratic reformers are focused on a few elites being in control of districts and schools rather than democratically controlled education policy. Disingenuously, they simultaneously promote this elegant but false narrative of civil rights and economic efficiencies as the primary benefit of these top-down approaches. However, what the anti-democratic policies really offer is the opportunity for elites to profit handsomely from the education system by privately controlling the capital associated with our public school systems. As observed in Chicago and elsewhere, charter schools offer new opportunities to profit from sweetheart construction, land, and lease deals. They typically offer double and triple the rate of returns on bonds to Wall Street compared to traditional public schools. For-profit charters are able to skim dollars off the education of every child. The online charters are a prime example of this. Some charters have even become lucrative vehicles for creating income-based loopholes in immigration laws. Across the spectrum, aristocratic policies are constructed such that a few elites control the policy rather than our local communities. For example, if the Home Rule takeover had gone through in Dallas, a politically appointed board would have had control of a $1 billion, that's billion with a B, budget, likely without any democratic public accountability or oversight. In fact, did you know that the New Orleans Recovery School District has been sued by various members of the public, including academics, to release its data to people other than those that have handpicked politically? And now, only after 10 years, has the RSD been forced by the Louisiana courts to release their data to people other than those handpicked politically. My mother always says, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Another notable common denominator amongst aristocratic reformers, such as Rahm, Reed, the Koch brothers, and many others, they're anti-union. For the Democrats, this has been a really confusing journey. In the past, it was left up to Republicans to brand unions as terrorist organizations. Now the aristocratic wing of the Democratic Party has taken to criticizing unions too. And I promise this quick commercial. A quick plug for the organizing rally that goes until 6 p.m. right in front of this building. I am proud California Faculty Association, son of a Michigan Nurses Association member, grandson of UAW workers, and great-grandson of a United Mine worker. I stand in solidarity with SEIU. In fact, I believe that teacher organizations are a key constituency for defeating Wall Street and the rest of the aristocratic reformers. I don't think anyone can explain this position or say it better than Martin Luther King Jr. The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. Which brings me to the ongoing reauthorization of ESEA. For you non-education folks, that's No Child Left Behind currently. There are competing proposals for the revision of this wide-reaching education law on the conference table. The teacher organizations have placed a variety of community-based, democratically controlled ideas in the conversation, including dashboard measurements, which I will talk about in just a moment. But what the revision of NCLB still has in common with its former and current self is that the primary policy mechanisms leave control in the hands of a select few politicians and elites, not the communities in which schools reside. For Republicans who espouse local control and Democrats who support community empowerment, a revision solely by erasure of the most egregious while leaving the best base system in place is a disconnect. However, with the aforementioned context of dark money and that's controlling politicians and the discourse, it is readily apparent why the education policies of then and now continue to have a top-down aristocratic reform flavor. To be consistent with their political ideology, it would make more sense for Democrats and Republicans to consider empirically based, democratically controlled education reforms in the reauthorization. So you're asking yourself, what are those alternatives? That's what I was promised. What are the alternatives to aristocratic school reforms discussed today? I posit democratically controlled community-based education reform. For each of the top-down reforms proposed and presented by aristocratic reformers, there is a community-based alternative. Here are a few examples. So I first got my start. I finished at the other U of M, the University of Michigan, in the 1990s. And I moved to Houston. What I didn't know is that I arrived in Houston in the middle of a maelstrom. That was the accountability and testing miracle that actually never happened in Texas. No Child Left Behind was imported from what Texas had been doing for a decade with accountability and testing, and it became the law of the land. But what we knew in Texas at the time was it was a facade. It was never a miracle. Texas had never had an education miracle. They'd never had high schools with 0% dropout rates. They'd never closed achievement gaps. They had in-run-tized the data. So what is an alternative to top-down approaches to testing, but more specifically in this case, accountability? Well, about 4 years ago at the University of Texas, we started a work group to think about how can we do accountability in a bottom-up way? How can we be more constructivist? How can we put together a measure of schools, a measure of districts that was a multiple measure approach, but also provided community input? We called it at the time community-based accountability. Well, 2 years ago, California codified a bottom-up approach to accountability. They call it local accountability. And this is an alternative to the top-down approach that has been the law of the land since Bush and Secretary Page imported what Texas was doing. So what happens is communities put together strategic plans that are short-term and long-term, and they have multiple measures. These multiple measure approaches focus on special populations, at-risk students, ELL students, and foster students currently. And in those processes, community organizations get to work together with the district to set the priorities. The thing, if you think about No Child Left Behind, how much say or how much input do local communities have in did they have in AYP, Aggregate Yearly Progress, or any of the other metrics in NCLB? The answer is none. So there are ways in practice, and California is a prime example of this, that you can do accountability in a bottom-up, community-based approach. We are 1 year in. We've written a few things that will be coming out in the peer-reviewed literature. There's still work to do on this issue, but you can do accountability in a bottom-up, community-based way. It doesn't have to be top-down. It doesn't have to be focused primarily on exams. You can consider a variety of measures, the things that we really care about. Exams, we believe, are a proxy for what we care about in our society. But why not actually consider the measures, whether it be disparate disciplinary rates, whether it be college attendance rates? We have all that data now. So why not consider that data as communities rather than tests as a proxy? Now, speaking of tests, how many of you had spelling tests on Friday? something, right? Okay. Now, if you think about assessment 20 years ago in this country, think about assessment 30 years ago in this country. Assessment was essentially on the local level. Now, what we haven't been talking about is what No Child Left Behind did was it privatized assessment. It made assessment top down because at the federal level, they had certain requirements for what had to occur in each and every state, right? And who came to fill that gap? Pearson and the other testing companies, in collaboration with states, created these criterion-based tests that met the requirements of the legislation. So essentially what happened is we, with No Child Left Behind, experienced the privatization of assessment. That's a different approach than what we've seen over the last several decades in our school. So there are examples, and there's the opt-out movement is very prominent here. With the onset of the Common Core test, these are all, I think of them as they have similar stakes. They may be different tests, but they have similar stakes and similar consequences. That's why they're high-stakes exams. So the conversation should be, how do we change the stakes of these exams so that they can be more instructive and valuable for educators? And the second thing is, how do we do assessment in a community-based, bottom-up way? Monty Neal and the Fair Test folks have many examples of how in New York, a set of schools have approached assessment in a community-based way. So assessment does not have to be privatized. It does not have to be top-down. We have examples, empirical examples of how we can do assessment in bottom-up ways. So when we evaluate teachers, it's linked to these assessments. And so what we see with value-added models, so these are multi-level statistical models that are used to evaluate teachers. And a person like me can sit in an office and tell the district, this teacher is not so hot. That teacher is not so hot, because I've calculated this formula. But it turns out that these formulas are unstable. 70% of the teachers move between categories year to year. Now, is the reason why those teachers go from bad to terrible to good to bad, is it because they're bad teachers or terrible teachers or excellent teachers in a particular year? It's the vagaries of the statistical models, right? And so the thing is that the value-added models that aristocratic reformers are pressing, Arne Duncan and others, are a top-down approach, often privatized, farmed out to consultants such as Sanders and others. But there are bottom-up approaches. For example, PAR, Peer Assistance and Review, is a bottom-up approach, a community-based approach where expert consultant teachers do evaluate the teacher quality of teachers across the district. So you have actual experts instead of a number cruncher like me sitting and deciding based on a hierarchical linear model, which is just multi-level models, who the good teachers and the bad teachers are. And then finally, let me loop back to charter schools. I've been called a charter school lover and a charter school hater in the same week. What a lot of people don't know about me is I was an instructor at a charter school. I sat on the board of the UT charter school. My daughter attended the UT charter school. So I've really pressed myself to think very carefully about the charter school movement. What I consider to be problematic are those charter schools that ignore equity and access in some of the ways that Dr. Shirazi talked about, and the 12 ways that Kevin Wellner from the National Education Policy Center talked about in his Dirty Dozen. We must hold charter schools accountable. They should not be public schools that act like private schools. And so can we do charter schools in a way that's not corporate? You see a set of charter schools from Arizona, Basis charter schools, Great Heart charter schools. A, they only situate their schools in wealthy neighborhoods. B, if you don't cut it, if you academically, or if you don't follow the student code of conduct to the T, then they will expel you out of the charter school. So the question is, do we also want charter schools that are nonprofit in name only? Because what they do is the charter school board will run the business of the school through a for-profit arm of the school. And then you ask yourself, well, how do you get on a charter school board? Well, Minnesota is one of the rare places where a charter school board functions differently than other places, and there's some communities say in charter school board, but that in Minnesota is unusual in that regard in the whole United States. But the point is that we should think about how we do charter schools in a community-based way. So for example, when I was at Northeastern Law School, one of the questions was about a charter school started by a Native American tribe. And the Native American tribe started that school because they wanted curriculum and pedagogy that was more relevant for their community. That kind of charter school makes sense to me. Corporate charter schools don't make as much sense to me because of the reasons that we're talking about. Another good example of this is Travis Heights Elementary, where the faith community, the teachers' organization, the teachers in that school, the local community had a vote to decide if they wanted their school to be a charter school instead of a magnet or any other set of alternatives that are out there. And so as a community, they made that decision. Previously, the decision had been made for them by the school board, and they had hired a particular charter school corporation to come in and run that school. So there are community-based ways that we can approach charter schools. They don't have to be for profit. They don't have to be disinterested in equity. We can have schools that are accessible to the communities where those kids live. So in the spring, I first introduced the idea of aristocratic formers during my Cambridge Forum talk that I gave in Harvard Square. And you can check out the longer discussion about aristocratic reformers there on my YouTube channel. But it's very clear that top-down and private controlled reform has marshaled extensive resources to fund an ecology to reach into communities, into the halls of Congress, across the spectrum in our society. And not to pick on them too much, I actually haven't mentioned it, oh, I did mention them once. Teacher America. The national and local ecology that Teacher America has created is unparalleled. Let me give you an example from New Orleans. There's a really interesting peer-reviewed paper by Carrie Kretschmar that details how Teacher America was the primary node by which reform occurred in New Orleans. And they show, they conduct a network analysis of how the charter schools, the foundations, were all connected through this ecology was created and maintained, maybe I shouldn't say created, was maintained and interacted by Teacher America. You see Teacher America creating this network and this ecology on the national level. Two interesting examples. One, a billionaire from San Jose, California, funded TFA to be the staffers for Democrats and Republicans on the Senate and House education committees. So imagine if the petroleum industry said, you know, we would like to fund the staffers on energy for the Democrats and the Republicans on the Energy Committee in the House and Senate side. Could you imagine the outcry? But yet Teacher America is able to embed their education staffers in the offices of Republicans and Democrats on these committees. It's brilliant. Now, another thing that a lot of people are not really aware of is that Teacher America has also penetrated the civil rights organizations in DC. What do I mean by this? I recently blogged about this. I was really surprised when the civil rights organization signed on to a letter that came out against parents opting out of testing across the United States. That sounded a little curious to me. So like the investigative journalist that I am now, I checked with some of my DC sources to understand where was this coming from. And it turns out that a Teacher America alum inside of one of the civil rights organizations, who happens to be Anglo, was leading this charge and having the civil rights organization sign on not only to being anti-opt-out, but being pro-high-stakes testing. And let's be real, folks. High-stakes testing was created in China 1,500 years ago to sort society. That's what high-stakes tests still do today. High-stakes tests sort society. And so I think that it's quite disappointing, it's quite upsetting that the civil rights organizations in DC that the Teach for America folks have embedded into these organizations and created this ecology to promote high-stakes testing, to continue this privatization of testing, all under the guise of civil rights. During the question and answer after my Cambridge Forum lecture, a parent asked what she could do to controvert the aristocratic reformers. The teacher who was the moderator on the stage said something to the effect, "I'm not rich, I'm not wealthy, what can I do?" At the time, I termed it people power, and I've had some months to think about what that means. We often focus on how organizations can interact, how we can ally, how we can form coalitions. But today I want to instead focus on how we individually can interact, ally, and form coalitions on behalf of community-based reform. Social media is now the technological canvas by which we can combat the aristocratic reformers. I see some bloggers in the room. I want to give them some shout-outs. A canvas which has none of the traditional gatekeepers. Because if you think about it, if you want to send an op-ed, who's the gatekeeper at the newspaper? If you want to get a particular story on MSNBC, you have the producer, that's the gatekeeper. But what social media allows us to do is to have the canvas by which no one can be our gatekeeper. So I'd like to quickly discuss a few social media platforms and talk about how to utilize them to create your own personal ecology for community-based reform. You know, often we come to these talks and we go away and we say, that was nice, what can I do? And so I really want to talk to you about how you can create your own personal ecology around education. Okay, and then I'm supposed to go, hit it. Is he ready? Oh. You ready? Okay. So I'm just going to run through a couple of quick things. So first, the primary thing that I do, you know, as a faculty member, you have to make some decisions. And you've heard the term publish or perish. So fortunately now I'm a full professor, and it allows me to do this kind of work. And I get this question often from assistant folks. But one of the things that I spend a lot of my time on is communicating scholarship to the public, to policymakers, to parents, to communities, to teachers, and also using my blog to give voice to folks. One of the things that I often do is I am able to provide voice to Teach for America alums, either anonymous or on the record, about their experiences in schools. And I do that quite often. In fact, one of my own former students from the University of Texas wrote one of the most popular posts ever on my blog. Let's see if you can see it. Here it is. Tell all from TFA and KIP teacher, unprepared, isolation, shame, and burnout. That was her experience as a first-year teacher in KIP as a TFA core member. And this may look like CNN, but this is a one-man show, folks. You know, over time, you sort of learn some of the tricks of the trade. But this allows me, you know, they talk about the ivory tower, and you know what they say about the ivory tower. Rapunzel very rarely lets down her hair, right? And so this is my opportunity to make my scholarship accessible and also have a community of scholars be able to make their work accessible. And Dr. Shirazi wanted me to say why I started my blog, so I'm going to do that. This is not part of what I expected to say. But I wrote a piece that was published in the Berkeley Review of Education on KIP, charter schools. And what we found in the Texas data was that 40% of African American kids were leaving KIP before their senior year. Now, comparable numbers for the district in Houston was around 5%. Now, what was interesting about this is that KIP often says that they have 100% graduation rates and 100% of private college. But what they really should be saying, at least for black kids, is that 100% and 60% are going on to college, which in my stats class is not really 100%, right? And so KIP pushed back really hard, right? Because they have marketing people, they have public relations people, they have a website, and I had no recourse, right? And then I went on Melissa Harris Perry in 2012 and first started talking about this, and Jonathan Alter blew his top and said, I'm not going to allow you to diss KIP charter schools on national television. Right? You know, I thought of that as him exemplifying privilege. So I thought to myself, I need to be able to respond to this. And so that was the genesis of this. And in that summer, I was on faculty in Black Studies. They actually had a training about how faculty can prosecute blogs. Now, let me warn you, a blog is a lot of work. And sometimes you feel like a slave to your blog, because in the back of your mind, you have to be preparing the next blog post, right? I see some insanity up there. So that's one of the things. You know, you can do a blog, because that's what a lot of folks automatically in their mind go to when they think, I'm going to create an ecology, I'm going to start a blog. But let me just tell you, it's a big commitment, right? But it can have a big impact. Okay, so let's talk. Let's do a fun one. Let's talk about Instagram. You're like, Instagram? So I've just recently started to use Instagram, and one of the reasons why I started, here's a couple of photos from today. Did you know that IAS has their own M&Ms? So that's the kind of thing that I can put on Instagram, right? Because it's interesting, right? So I think I like to use Instagram, A, because of the audience that it reaches, right? There's a lot of younger folks and students, right? The other thing I like to use Instagram, because it allows you to be a little more artsy than say like a Twitter or a LinkedIn, which is not really appropriate to post artsy photos on a place like LinkedIn, right? And it, you know, it's like just a different, that's the form that Instagram is. Now LinkedIn, I think the best way to use LinkedIn is it allows you to create the largest ecology and have direct contact with folks. So my ecology on LinkedIn or my connections is 7,500. And what's interesting about this is it provides a lot of different opportunities. One, you can do what they call posts. So it's kind of like you can do your own blog post here. And it's going to go to the inbox of all 7,500 people. Now, does that mean that all 7,000 people are going to read that post? No. I usually average 200 to 400 people. But at least you have an opportunity to get those eyeballs. Because you know how it is. Information nowadays is coming at us like a water hose, right? And so with LinkedIn is a little different than Facebook, and I'll talk about Facebook in a minute, but it allows you to communicate to every single person you're connected with. Facebook, we were talking about gatekeepers, has a gatekeeping function, and I'll mention that in just a second. Another great thing about LinkedIn, and two more tips, right? The first tip is, you know how you get emails and you're on a list with a bunch of folks? And so one of the things you can do with LinkedIn is if you go here, you can actually add folks by their email list and build your network rapidly. So let's say I get an email about ed policy and Latinos, and there's folks on there that I'd like to be connected with. All I have to do is cut and paste those emails out of whatever the email came in, paste it into my LinkedIn, and then I automatically can send invitations to folks. You can't do that kind of thing in LinkedIn. You can't do that kind of thing in Twitter, but it allows you to grow. And the other thing is that it allows you to have a Rolodex, a really, really cool Rolodex. So if you hear that somebody was just appointed to the Hillary campaign, and you would like to be able to communicate with her, right? She wasn't at the Hillary campaign before, she was at a different foundation. Well, it turns out you were connected with her on LinkedIn. So now, because you connected with someone, you know, a year or 2 years ago, and you want to communicate a message to them, you can do so because LinkedIn is this really fantastic Rolodex of contact information, okay? Well, it looks like people are tweeting at me in ridiculous numbers here. So there's 37 new notifications. Now, some of you think to yourself, I don't want to do Twitter. It's you know, and you might be thinking this to yourself about all of these things, right? And yes, it's true. There's a time commitment involved. But you're here because you're collecting information. You're curious. Well, what Twitter will do for you is if you follow the right people, the information will come to you. That great New York Times article that you don't have time to sort through the New York Times to find is going to come to you, right? And you don't have to get on Twitter because you want 2 million followers like the latest Bollywood actor, right? You can get on Twitter just because you want to follow folks and the information comes to you. You don't necessarily have to worry about how many followers you have, right? I only have 3,500 followers or something like that. But yet, Harvard Education Next named the 9th most influential person on social media, even though the people above me have many, many more followers, right? So you don't want to measure yourself based on your followers. And the thing is that nothing is too much on Twitter. You can tweet 72 times a day and nobody will care because it goes by really fast. If you put 72 posts on Facebook, how are your friends going to respond? Right? So if you really want to say a lot, Twitter's the place where you can do that. You can say a lot here. Okay? And you can, by mentioning them, so what you're looking at my notifications, these are all people that have mentioned me. So let's just see. This is for the progressive. If you put somebody's name, if you mention their Twitter name, it'll go right to them. So you can also communicate, like how many of you listen to Public Enemy? Anybody? Chuck D? Okay. So I sent a message to Chuck D about a song that really spoke to me at like 2 o'clock in the morning, right? About don't give up the fight, because sometimes we feel a little discouraged. And so I sent him a Twitter message. The brother added me, right? He read it, right? So you can communicate with people. How else would I have been able to communicate with Chuck D from Public Enemy? So that also has that really cool aspect, okay? And then finally, See, I'm getting stuff from folks. Yes, I might be here on October the 31st when the University of Michigan plays the University of Minnesota. If you have tickets, please let me know. So Facebook is where you're going to get your most exposure because almost everybody has Facebook. The problem with Facebook is it has an algorithm. And what I mean by that is when you put a post, not everybody sees it. Now, nobody really knows what the Facebook algorithm is for people to see your posts. There are ways that you can, for example, highlight particular posts, and in theory that means it's going to go to more people. But as you can see, I have 3,392 connections on Facebook. Of those, I probably know 5% of the people on Facebook because I daily get people adding me. So your posts obviously don't go to 3,000 people. So the way I think, and this is, I don't know this because it's a closely guarded secret, is it appears that Facebook will communicate people who you are communicating with. So if you're messaging folks, or if you're liking their stuff, or they like your things, then your post will get visibility to those people. Otherwise, and it looks like they give you a couple of opportunities to like different folks, and then those people leave your feed, right? So Facebook does have a gatekeeper function, but it's still the way that, for example, my blog probably draws 80% of its viewership from Facebook. Okay, did I cover all of them? I think I did. And I want to leave time for questions about these things. So let me do the crescendo. Okay. So I think it's important to draw strength from our allies. Via social media, we can individually create new alliances and an individual ecology. But, as you're thinking to yourself right now, it requires commitment, it requires creativity, and it requires some bravery. Because as you open yourself up to engaging in these issues, you will inevitably draw critics. As you can probably see from my work on cloaking inequity and social media, I've also learned it's important to know history and real stories. You draw purpose from the really lived experiences of people, not just the numbers. As a quantoid, I always have to slap myself a little bit and say, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the counter-narrative and the stories that come from communities. That's how you create a whole picture of our community's needs and desires for policymakers and policy influencers. As you create your own personal social media ecology, you will be challenged by powerful structures. So be prepared to fight those battles with allies and inspire those who come after you to do the same. To paraphrase one of my favorite quotes, I challenge you today to connect enthusiastically, give relentlessly, and then lead bravely. If we do this, a future of community-based education reform can be ours. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment. I've got a question about the aristocratic reformers and your characterization of their motivation.
Sure.
I can't understand what's the motivation of the Koch brothers and the Gates Foundation. I don't see if they have a pecuniary interest in education reform.
Well, the Gates Foundation is like any tech company. I think it goes in all different directions, right? But I think the Koch brothers is a little clearer. They're neoliberals, which is that we need to privatize everything we can outside of the government space, right? You see, for example, the application of neoliberal theory in a place like Chile, where 2 decades ago Pinochet said, we don't want the government to subsidize education anymore. We want it to be privately provisioned, right? And so I think that's the consistent denominator, and what I see the Koch brothers do is that they would prefer things be privately provisioned rather than publicly provisioned. The Gates Foundation, I think that's a much more complex, because the Gates Foundation does some really cool stuff. One of the things that they're doing right now, and I can't believe I just said that, is, I'm also on the governing board of the NEA Foundation. And one of the things that they're funding right now is how state locals can be more engaged in conversations about social justice, social issues, in addition to just advocating for the bread and butter issues that unions typically have. How do they prioritize those conversations? I think that's a really cool grant that Gates funded. That being said, the Common Core stuff to me is just more of the same with a different name. We've had this standards and high stakes testing stuff since so standards came along later, but the testing in the 80s. So I think that those particular priorities of the Gates Foundation in terms of the testing high stakes accountability, I take very serious issue with. So the Gates Foundation, I think that, I can give them a little bit of leeway, because there are some things that they do that I would agree with, but there's many things that they do that I don't agree with. I hope that answers the question. Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk, and I also really appreciated your complexity that you brought to charter schools, because I, like you, am both a critic of them, but I'm heavily involved in them. And my colleagues know this, I have children who've gone through charter schools here that have started very much out of teacher-based and community-based interests, and I think you can talk to that as well. But I want to tie both my questions, or my example around charter schools, to something larger that you brought up around community. Sure. I should say that the charter school that I'm involved in also, I think, is much more complex than a picture we sometimes paint of charter schools, and you did talk specifically about privatized ones, but the charter school that my kids have gone to and I've served in various capacities also just was the first charter school to unionize in Minnesota. And it has very, very lively debates around public-private contentions, around access, equity, etc.
Sure.
And I can appreciate those. And so part of my interest is understanding, and not just at a broad level about who controls what and what charter schools are or what unions are, but the nitty-gritty of the kinds of debates that happen in and out of kinds of schools. In contrast, I have a child who also goes to a public high school, and on the one hand, while there are many interests that we share with other parents who go to that public high school, there's probably less opportunity to actually debate, even though I disagree heavily with some perspectives at the charter school. There's less opportunity to really get in and influence the board and debates that happen around curriculum and textbook, etc. And I've had these conversations with teachers. Sure. So this begs the larger question, I think, to skip a little bit, to what do you mean by the community? Because the charter school pulls from this community all over the Twin Cities with certain kinds of interests, but it's not a place-based community, and the public school pulls from more of a place-based community, but with broader diversity. So what do you mean when you talk about community and community, like who is that community, and how do we form that community? Because community to me is about how they get in and debate about these issues.
Well, charter schools decide what the community is going to be. I mean, they decide their footprint, right? They decide who's going to be on their board. Although in Minnesota it's a little different, but in most places that's the way. I'm a little rich, sorry. So that's the question that we have now. In Austin, I was talking about that community-based charter school in Austin. Well, here's what happened in that situation, is the school board signed this sweetheart deal with IDEA corporate charter schools, and the community was unhappy. And so what do you think they did to that school board? That next November, they voted them out of office, right? So there's recourse, right? Now, well, I testified recently in Texas on parent trigger. Now, I guess there's a lot of things I could say about it, but what I told them, and what Parent Trigger is Don't Back Down is actually a movie about Parent Trigger. What Parent Trigger is 50+1. So 50+1 of the current parents in that particular year vote to turn their school over to a corporation or whoever, then they can do so, right? Now, I think the reason why I raised this issue, right, is because is that the community that should be making a decision like that? Is it only the current parents? What about the parents next year? Or what about the public who paid for that building in 1960, right? So I think that's an important question, but I think that those are questions that we should solve and decide in democratic debates. Well, a lot of aspects of charter schools, those debates, and your school sounds like an ideal situation to. And I'm going to be honest with you, I probably get an email once a day asking me about a charter school. Like yesterday, the email was about the Tiger Woods charter school. 2 days, so I get lots of emails about it's impossible because charter schools are so different. Just like you say automobile, There's Buicks, there's Cadillacs, there's Ferraris, right? And so it's impossible to paint charter schools with one broad brush. But the one broad concern that I have with charter schools, which is what is the say that we have democratically in any particular school, and who should have that say, right? A unionized charter school is clearly an outlier in this current context. Charter schools are not going away. So we as a society have got to get it right. I don't think they're going away anytime soon. So I think that we need to be able to think about how we ensure that charter schools are democratically accountable, just like our school boards. Now we can say the school boards don't listen, but I'll tell you what, there's not many votes that happen in any particular school board election. So if you want to get rid of a school board member, you can do that if there's an issue that is awaits that unintended public. So I think that's the key piece, which is we need charter schools that are focused on equity and access. I think it's important for teachers to be able to organize, because we know that, I heard one charter school teacher tell me that working at these schools in New Orleans was like working in sweatshops, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we can do policy-wise, and the list is very, very long. I can't even broach all of them here, but I think that the common denominator is that communities need to be able to have input into their schools. We cannot take that and hand it over to just a few people. Yes, sir.
So take that same question and bring it back to public school and the communities there. In Minnesota is different than most other states because the majority of education funding comes from the state.
Yeah.
So arguably, if there's a statewide community
Sure.
That has an interest in the proficiency of students,
Sure.
and that is different than a community-based
Sure.
approach. And I think the article that you wrote reflected the fact that in California there's a strong tie between local property taxes and the community accountability. So how should we think about this in terms of our broader shared interests in the outcomes for kids?
Well, I think one of the other flavors of aristocratic reform that I didn't want to levy against all the reforms, but just another thing to think about, which is that a lot of the conversations that they have are about reforms that are on the cheap, right? Which is, how do we change administratively pieces of policy and don't necessarily have a cost associated with them? When you go into, you get the legislators, especially in Texas, right? The legislators there, they work for like 4 months every 2 years, right? And so it's like a mad dash. And the first question they ask is, what is the money that we must allot for this particular bill? So I think one of the things we need to first think about is, what does equity look like? Because I think part of the challenge is that even we thought that when we centralized funding that it was going to create more equity. But in some states, what they actually use that purse string power to do is reduce the funding to schools. You see this in Wisconsin, you see this in Texas, you've seen this in California for the last decade as the economy languished. So, and I think the broader piece that we should be happy about is that our schools are actually very competitive internationally when we look at the top 10% of our schools. The real issue we have is the inequities in the system. And one of the things that I typically talk about is we know that this is the elephant in the room. We know that certain parts of our society are screwed over on purpose, or accidentally on purpose, and here's how you know it. So just close your eyes. Okay, now imagine, it could be this city, Minneapolis, it could be any other city, but just imagine the really, really nice schools. Now, imagine the not so nice schools. Now think about which kids are attending the really, really nice schools and who's not attending. And that's part of the elephant in the room, which is that, yes, we had this idea in school finance the last 20 years, we'll centralize the pot because you had these, some places where you had been spending $30,000 and some places $8,000. So I think that there's been progress on that front. But we still know that the inequities are out there. It's that big elephant in the room that Black and Latino kids, and then here, I volunteered in a Hmong elementary school back in the 1990s, and it was February, and I was cold. But just a beautiful community and a beautiful school when I was here. So I think the main question is, yes, we've gone here in terms of, but we still have these severe inequities, and that's where we see the gaps with us internationally. Is within those inequities, is the within and between variance. It's that within that's really problematic for us. And not only does that variance occur between districts, it occurs within districts. You can probably imagine within the Minneapolis public schools, you know where the schools are in the poor communities and what they look like. And in the nicer communities where they have Minneapolis public schools, they're a little nicer. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to grapple with, which is, yes, we've done the centralized funding, but are we really okay with the inequities in these policies? And are we really okay that the aristocratic reformers are so focused on education reform on the cheap for poor kids? Because it's actually not a mystery what works in education. What we don't know is how to do education cheap for Black and Latino and Hmong kids. We don't know how to do that. We know that if you do pre-K, you get a lot of bang for your buck. Almost 0.8 standard deviations, right? But pre-K is really expensive, right? For every kid. We know that smaller class sizes, and we have debates about this, but even the most conservative estimate has a standard deviation of about 0.23, right? Which is a fifth of the standard deviation. So, and there's a whole bunch of other gold standards in the literature, but none of those are free, right? None of them are inexpensive. And we wonder why Louisiana performs so poorly. Well, we know why. We know why Mississippi performs poorly. We know why Texas wanted to tell the nation that they were doing great, but they're actually not doing so hot. And Arizona, the same sort of thing, right? Which is that, and Florida is another one. They do great in fourth grade NAEP, but the longer those kids stay in the fourth, because Bush is going to talk, Jeb's going to talk about this. He's going to talk about the Florida education miracle. But in fourth grade, the NAEP is outstanding. They're top 10. But the longer those kids stay in Florida schools, the worse they do. Their graduation rates, bottom of the heap. 8th grade NAEP, middle of the pack. ACT, SAT, bottom of the pack. And so I think what we want to be thinking about too is what are the investments that we can make on top of the investments that we're making now that can give us the bang for the buck. Let's not be so in love with educational reform on the cheap, primarily for poor kids.
So that's actually a great segue into the question that I have, and I should probably mention ahead of time that I'm the daughter of a public school teacher. But something that struck me in the context of what you were saying, now what you're saying about investments is, well, okay, we can invest more in students, we can talk about community-based education, and we can talk about accountability, but there's still a problem in terms of attracting good people into the teaching profession and retaining them. And this is Teach for America, basically. Something I expected you to say is Teach for America sells this mirage that you can somehow have a great teacher with 6 weeks of summer training. And one of the things that strikes me as potentially problematic with a community-based model is the type of accountability that you might get, which might actually be problematic in many cases for teachers.
Teach for America is an example of a top-down approach, right? Which is we're going to decide which teachers we're going to send to your community, which we think is most appropriate. And then we're not going to teach them anything about the communities that they're parachuting into and parachuting out of, right? I really try not to pick on Teach for America. I do my best. But the thing is that I was in Texas in the reason why I might look a little tired is I was in Texas 2 days ago visiting a school all day. And they were talking about what it takes to get cosmetology. It takes 1,500 hours to get cosmetology certification in Texas. But do you know how many hours it takes to become alternatively certified teacher in Texas? You can hit the classroom up to 30 hours. So that means that cosmetology students get 1,470 more hours than the average adult cert teacher. And so we're having, and the thing is that we as colleges of education are actually training enough teachers, but the problem is that 40 to 50%, and there's a lot of argument about these numbers, right? So I'm trying to give you a wide range. 40 to 50% of teachers leave after 5 years. And the newest, hottest conversation right now is that we're losing Black and Latino teachers even faster. They don't want to stay, right? And, there's a lot of conversation about why that is. There's conversations about how the profession's under attack, how the pay is low, the working conditions are terrible. There's a lot of conversations about why that's the case, but it's a crisis. it's a crisis for us because on the one hand, we're setting these really high standards. California has these really high standards to become a teacher. My wife wanted to be a teacher, but she couldn't because of all the challenges, the hurdles that she had to go through. Well, then she comes to me and says, well, the school said they'd give me emergency to teach special ed. And I said, no way, right? Because there's a back door that we're not talking about. 65% of all new teachers are this back door into the profession. And then they get there unprepared. Teacher America folks will tell you, they get there, they get unprepared, they get frustrated, and they get blamed because they weren't prepared to hit the classroom, right? But yet we set them up for failure. It's not just TFA, we set these alt certs up for failure too. And then we wonder why we have this rotating door of teachers primarily for Black and Latino kids, right? Because the wealthy are not going to hire Teacher America to teach their kids. They're not going to hire the alt certs either. They get the best of the best. What we're really talking about is the type of teacher quality we're going to provision for poor kids, poor Black and Latino kids, and poor white folks that live out in rural areas. That's what we're really talking about here. Yes.
I'm just wondering if there's been any research, because I think this is a really interesting thing that I've heard sort of like on the ground, but about the climate of high stakes testing, scripted curriculum, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How does that also factor into, Black and brown teachers leaving, or any teacher with an alternative, even style? Is there any research around that you know?
So this is of course on the margins of what I do, right? Because we as faculty, we focus on very specific stuff. So I can talk a little bit about this, but Rich Milner at Pittsburgh and Joyce King at Georgia State, those are folks that are going to be able to give you, but if you put me on the radio, I could say, 5 sentences and, move on. But I try not to do that, right? I'm not a talking head. So I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't find myself to be particularly expert in that area. But I think that, I'm just going to leave it there. I don't want to talk beyond my research. So, yes.
There's underlying a lot of what you're saying is a debate that we are not having as well in Minnesota as I would like, which has to do with how choice and reform and segregation and then inequities come together. Yeah. So if you could just talk a little bit about that. Yeah. And I'm very interested in your reflections on both California and Texas, which are bigger and weirder than we are.
So if there's a soundbite, unfettered choice results in more segregation. If you look at open enrollment policies, just go to Google, type in open enrollment segregation. You will see study after study that shows that open enrollment results in more segregation. Chile has undertaken this voucher experiment for 2 decades. What they found was it actually accentuated the segregation in their society. In January, they decided that they were no longer going to allow vouchers to go to private schools because they had done so poorly and had such dramatic impacts on their society. Now, what's interesting about the Chile situation is that the students have been protesting for years. And if you go to YouTube, you can see the students protesting these choice and voucher policies. But have you ever heard about that in the United States of America? Yeah. My students went to Chile to study vouchers, and they were in the middle of a clash between the Army and the students over vouchers and choice and the education system. But of course, the U.S. media is not covering at all the fact that there's civil unrest going on because choice has escalated these issues. And we have several peer-reviewed papers. If you're interested in this, we can show you the data. We have the data, right? When I went to the University of Arkansas, which is like the home of Walmart and neoliberals' approaches to education, one of the folks who's very prominent on this, pressed me on this issue, and I said, Chile's a prime example. And he said, I don't study Chile. And so, and that's the thing is that, the evidence is out there on this. We have a new paper that's going to be in the Stanford Law and Policy Review. And so if you look at the state data, so on the aggregate, folks say, well, charter schools, if you look at the aggregate data in the state, we have about the same amount of ELs, a little bit less special ed, about the same Black kids and at-risk kids. It's about the same. But so what we did was we did a geospatial analysis, and we drilled down and we said, okay, schools within a 3-mile radius, are the charter schools more or less segregated than similar schools? And what we found, so if you look at the aggregate numbers, they look the same, right? But when you actually drill down and look at the local schools, we found that the schools are more segregated for special pops and based on race. You know, the work out of the Civil Rights Gary Orfield's work, it showed that we basically resegregated our schools. And I think part of the challenge is that our legislators are sometimes okay with this. And I think part of the reason for that is that black legislators, they went to school with often mostly black folks. And so that's normalcy for them. The white folks went to school with mostly white folks. You know, I grew up in a school that was very diverse, and so a diverse context is what is normalcy for me. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the willpower to fetter choice? Because unfettered, and Diane was just saying, Diane Mavich was just telling me this last week, unfettered choice, and I probably stole this one from her, unfettered choice causes more segregation. And we as a society have to decide, do we want to have a balkanized society? Do we want our kids to see it as normal going to school with Latino kids and Somali kids and, you know, just, is that the kind of society that we want? Or do we want a balkanized society? And do we have the willpower? Because the Supreme Court, one more quick thing, the Supreme Court, in Parents Involved, decided that we couldn't involuntarily desegregate schools, right? But there are ways that we can desegregate schools using SES because we know there's a statistical relationship between race and class, right? And so there are places that are that have sought to segregate this, but in North Carolina, they've deconstructed most of those approaches, right? Because communities don't have the willpower to send their kids to school with different folks. Now, this has real consequences for me, right? And I'm just going to tell you a personal story, which is that my daughter came home and said to me, you know, such and such told me that her uncle hurt somebody really bad and he went to jail and he's going to be there a very long time, right? Then the next week she came on and said, I've been invited to a Jewish holiday celebration. I can't remember which celebration it was. The next week it was something else. So there was a little, you know, you can have feelings of joy, feelings of discomfort, but the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we comfortable sending our kids to school with kids that don't look like them and have a different economic status with them? I think that baby boomers did a little better on this than our grandparents' generation. Now, my hope is that my generation, X, Y, the millennials, that will do much better on this and decide that we have the willpower to fetter choice and to ensure that kids of different types, different racial ethnic backgrounds and different SES backgrounds, because there's one more quick thing I want to say. I also think that within communities of color, and this might not be a popular thing to say, that within communities of color, that sometimes they don't want their kids to go to school with other folks of color that are low SES. And I think you're seeing this in Texas because there's this big push by Latino parents to have these elite charter schools in San Antonio and some other places, right? That have these sort of restrictive policies that keep low SES kids out of those schools. And we could go through what those policies are, and include busing and codes of conduct and these sorts of things. But my only thinking on that is that now, and I haven't investigated this, but this is sort of my hypothesis, that we even have communities of color saying, we don't actually want our kids to go to school with low SES Latinos. Now, I think this is an important place of inquiry, and it's just anecdotal at this point, but I think it's something also for us to ponder. Yes.
And I don't know, this is a question that I think I'm thinking a lot about as being a part of a university and higher education, is what do we want out of education? I don't know how much of this is K through 12, especially in the higher education, are we manufacturing employees in colleges and universities, or are we developing engaged citizens or fuller humans?
Yes.
And how much of that ends up determining which policies determine are good or not?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's an excellent point. And, you know, as a person I'm also the director of the Doctorate in Education, and right before school started, we lost a couple of students out of our cohort. So I called them up and I wanted to talk with them about this. And I said, well, you know, when I thought about getting a doctorate, the first thing in my mind was not how much money am I going to make when I finish? What's the value added economically and my long-term earning curve? So when I sat down with these students, this is what they're thinking about, right? What is the economic return of this particular degree, right? When I was a history major at the University of Michigan, I wasn't thinking about what the long-term economic return was. I was thinking, I want to understand how our society has functioned, right? And so, you know, I think that's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. And what are the if you allow me to be a post-positivist just for a second, what are the metrics by which we can understand that? We wrote a report looking at comparing California, New York, and Texas. And, I thought to myself, I had this same thought, and I said, we're going to put the NAEP data in here, we'll put the ACT data in here, but you know what else we're going to put in here? We're going to put in the voting rates for young people by state. Because is citizenship something we should care about? Like engaged participants in a democracy? I think that's important. And so therefore, that should be a measure of our schools. What percentage of the voting age population is voting in different schools? Because schools can easily pass out voter registrations, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's an important question for us to think about. I think the primary mode that we've been thinking right now is, what is the economic return? Those are the days that we live in right now, and that was just not how I approached being a history major at the University of Michigan. What's my economic return of being a history major? Right? But nowadays, I think that is a prominent conversation. What is the economic return? Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak to some examples that you've maybe seen where children or young students participate in community-based.
Yes. I'm so glad you asked that question. So there's an organization called Californians for Justice, right? So in local county, I don't know how many of you had a chance to read the article that was like, required reading. But when the local accountability stuff was going through the legislature, this organization called Californians for Justice got high school students involved in the Capitol. They would bus them to the Capitol to be a part of the conversations about getting the legislation through the House, through the Senate, and onto the governor's desk, right? I think this is one of the most important things, because I think that the standardization and the deprofessionalization of teaching has impacted critical thinking in our schools, because there was this really interesting, something's a social problem when they make a Simpsons episode about it, right? So Lisa was sitting down with the standardized exam, right? And she reads through the 4 answers, and she's like, 3 of the answers were right, one of them, and she's like, I don't understand this test. There's only one right answer in life, right? Which is that, I think a broader conversation we can have is, how are these exams affecting the critical thinking skills if every kid thinks there's only one right answer to all these? I'm that person who, as you could probably see from my business cards and my Vita, is I don't think the rules necessarily always have to be followed, right? I'm not supposed to be doing this sort of scholarship as a faculty member, because we as faculty don't get rewarded for engagement with community in this way or any other way, really. And so I think that is one of the very important questions, which is, how do we engage students more in this conversation? One of the things that I've been doing in addition to that is I've been doing social media trainings for NAACP youth, teaching them how to be weapons for social justice on social media. So that's another really cool thing. So there's the Californians for Justice. I would look them up. They have really cool videos. I mean, you're going to get like a little tear, like the sort of incredible. I never would have thought that in high school as a freshman that I could go to the Capitol and sit down with legislators and talk about how a local approach to accountability would matter in my community, right? And then also, I think it's incumbent upon us to controvert this whole standardization scheme, which I really think is dumbing down this generation of kids. They're not allowed to have that space to be critical thinkers, because there's one right answer to everything. So I think also it's incumbent upon us, for those that are coming behind us, to ensure that we continue to have this vibrant approach to debate in democracy, and instill that in our children in our schools, instead of instilling in them that we're going to set the bounds of everything that happens here, right? It's really the approach, it's the John Dewey approach, the Deweyan approach, we were talking about this before, versus the Frederick Taylor approach of widgets, and everyone will think and be the same each and every day, right? Whereas the John Dewey approach allows you to work in groups, think critically, and come to consensus as you're working through towards any particular learning goals. One more? Ooh, you guys are wearing me out. These are good questions.
One more. High high-stakes testing got all the press with NCLB.
Right.
Behind the scenes, there were other reporting metrics like disciplinary referrals over identification and special ed, some of these other things that we didn't hear much about.
Yeah.
But, and my question is, now that you're working in communities and you're trying to get rid of some of these hierarchical top-down approaches, are there any metrics you might take with you?
No, I think that it's incumbent upon us to actually consider a variety of metrics. You know, most countries that have accountability systems, whether it's my school in Australia and others, they see this as information exchange. They collect this not to punish and slap people with a big stick over the head. Most countries don't approach accountability in that way. The thing is that the tests are they're not very valuable to us. It's like, you know, when I flew here, I could look down at the ground and see lots of small things, and I knew that, you know, they were buildings, and as I was flying in, right? But that's what most high-stakes tests are. They're like evaluation at 10,000 feet, not very valuable to educators, primarily only valuable to policymakers to hit people over the head with a stick. And so I think the more constructivist approach to measuring student success is multiple measures. Imagine if you go to the car dealer and you only decide to buy a car based on the rims. That's your only evaluative criteria. That is how we've gone about this with No Child Left Behind, plus maybe graduation and dropout, this sort of thing. So I think the disparate disciplinary, which is an issue that, to Obama's credit, he's really pushed on. There hasn't been a whole lot in education that Obama that has made me very happy. That's one of the things that I feel like they've been engaged on. The Promised Neighborhood's another one. But I think multiple measure approaches and thinking about what the stakes should be associated with particular data, and allowing communities to have say in the data that they care about, right? Are the three primary. Now, dashboards, from what I understand, dashboards of information that could include these sorts of things are in conference committee in the, I think it's Senate side bill, right? So it is possible that we could expand our way of assessing schools because it is in there. Now, whether it comes out of conference with the dashboards in there, I think remains to be seen. So, but no, I'm fully on board with multiple metrics. You know, I don't think that you know, I love data. I really like data. I really like data. For example, one of the only thing that I thought was cool about Race at the Top is it required them to have data sets that were connected between K-12 and higher ed. So we actually don't need ACT to tell us who's college ready. We can look at the data in higher education and see if they succeeded after 1 year. We can look at who graduated within 4 years. There's all sorts of data that we have now in these combined data set to help us understand if folks are college ready, right? We don't need ACT to tell us that number is 17. We actually have the data to understand that. So I'm not anti-data. I'm just I think any analyst will tell you the more data we have, the better we are about any understanding or any decision about any particular policy. So, thank you so much.